Assalamu alaikum friends. Welcome to SBR revision series for September 2021, and today we are going to cover IFRS 8, which is your operating segment. So the things that we are going to cover under operating segments are operating segment, definition of operating segment, aggregation, when to aggregate, when not to aggregate, reporting threshold. There are some threshold that you need to meet before you can report a segment, and then disclosure. So let's start with operating segment. Operating segment, this standard which is IFRS 8, okay, this is only for listed entity. If you are an unlisted entity or a small medium sized enterprise, you are not required to comply with IFRS 8. It is not applicable for you. Okay, so you need to remember this is only for the listed entity. Why? Because listed entity only will have different segments, big companies. That's the reason IFRS 8 is only applicable for listed entity. Okay, and they need to disclose information about operating segment. But what is operating segment? Operating segment is a component of an entity, part of an entity, which has this characteristics. Number one, it has to be a component which engages in business activity. That means from that segment you should be able to get revenue. It should be engaging in some business activity. Next, that their results, the operating results have to be reviewed by CODM, that is the chief operating decision maker. And number three, they have financial discrete information. So if these three things are there, then it is said that it's an operating segment. Information has to be available, results has to be reviewed by CODM, and it has to be engaging in a business activity. Okay, now from your exam kit questions, you can cover these two questions regarding IFRS 8, which is Garden and Kleinget. So let's start with aggregation. Okay, when do you aggregate and when do you not aggregate? So for aggregation, okay, you have to see, you can sometimes aggregate two or more operating segment. Remember, they have to be operating segment. When you're aggregating, all of them have to be aggregating operating segment. You cannot aggregate one operating segment and the other one is not an operating segment. No, the first, they have met the definition of operating segment. Now second thing comes whether to aggregate or not. So if two or more, okay, you can aggregate if they are reporting, if they are following a similar economic characteristics, then you can report it as a single operating segment. You can show it as a single operating segment rather than showing two or three, many different segments. But it has to be similar in terms of these four things before you aggregate. Number one, the product and services that they sell has to be similar. If they are selling entirely different product or a service, then you cannot aggregate the two segment. Okay, next, they should have the production process which are similar, then types of customers that they are selling to, and distribution method. So in this four aspect, they need to be similar, then only you can aggregate the operating segment. Okay, so whenever a question comes whether to aggregate the segment or not, you have to look out these four things. You have to talk about these 4 points here. Okay, now let us go to the reporting threshold, the important areas. This one, when do you recognize an operating segment and when you do not recognize? So for that you have to know the reporting threshold. Okay, so reporting threshold we have for 3 areas. Number one, revenue. Okay, that means you have to meet this quantitative threshold to recognize it. So for revenue, remember it includes both the revenue. One is to the external customer, the other one is inter-segment sales. External as well as internal, both sales. Inter means inside the group. Together have to be 10% or more of all the revenue from the all the operating segment. Combined revenue of all the operating segment. Okay, you're not only taking the external revenue. No, both internal and external has to be 10% or more. If it's 10% or more, let's say 12% of your revenue is sorry, 10%, let's say 20%, which is 10 more than 10%. So you are in, you have to report the this thing, the segment. Next, we are talking about profit or loss. So the first threshold is for revenue. Next, profit or loss. Here also is same, 10% or more. Okay, of the greater. Why of the greater? It depends, because some segment might be reporting losses, some segment might be reporting profit. So you cannot take the profit and the loss together. All the segment which are producing profit, you have to take them together. All the segment that are reporting loss, you have to take them together and see which one is higher, the profit amount or the loss amount. Whichever is higher, on that you have to take, you have to see whether it's exceeding 10% or not. Okay. Third one is asset. So here also you have to get more than 10%, 10% or more. That means even if you get 10%, you have to report. It's a operating segment which you have to separately report. Okay. So when you're taking the 10%, it has to be the combined assets of all operating segment. But in SBR level, mostly they will not give you so much of calculation to do in IFRS 8. If they give you IFRS 8, it will be mostly discussion part. So you have to be prepared. Like for discussion part, they might ask you the quantitative threshold. Then you might say that they have met the threshold, therefore they have to report, or they didn't meet the threshold, therefore they should not report, something like that. And there's a 75% threshold that you need to know. What is the 75% threshold? 75% threshold says that at least 75% of the entity's external revenue should be included in a reportable segment. External revenue only, not internal revenue, not intersegment sales. Revenue from only external customers. It should be at least 75%. So that means, okay, other segment also needs to be reported separately. Even if it does not meet the 10% threshold, remember in the above. Even if it's not reporting 10% or more of the revenue, 10% or more of the profit or loss, 10% or more of the assets, still you have to recognize it as a reportable segment separately. Why? So that so that you have to meet the 75% threshold. You have to reach it first. Remember that. If let's say you are having 4 segments, and out of 3 segments are reportable segment, that means they have met the threshold. But if you add them together, you see that 75% threshold, they are still not meeting it. They're 71%. That means that 4th segment that did not qualify as a reportable segment because it didn't meet the 10% threshold. Now you have to recognize it as a reportable segment separately, so that 75% threshold is met. Okay. Disclosure. Finally, the disclosure related to IFRS. So coming to disclosure, okay. Number one, what are the factors that you use to identify whether the entity is a reportable segment or not? You have to disclose. Second is, what is the type of product and services that are sold by each reportable segment? Because every segment sells different product and services. The type is different, so that you need to disclose so that you can compare easily. Next, for each reportable segment, entity should report on these things. What is their measure of profit or loss? What is their measure of total assets? What is their measure of total liabilities? If this amount is used in decision making, sometimes you might be using the liabilities to decide whether you will take it as a reportable segment or not. So if you are taking it as a decision, then yes, you have to report on it. So for IFRS 8, only this much you have to know: the quantitative threshold and also the when you have to aggregate or not. Okay. So next standard will be covering IFRS 9. Yes, the bigger standard, financial instrument standard. Right? So till then, thanks for watching.